Picture the most massive dinosaur you can possibly imagine. Like the absolute apex of prehistoric size.
Oh, man. Something that just shakes the earth with every single step, right?
Exactly. Got it in your head. Well, the blue whale is larger than that.
It really is.
It is physically larger than any dinosaur that ever existed. And yet, it sustains this unbelievable towering greatness by feeding almost exclusively on microscopic plankton.
Yeah, it's wild to think about.
But the real paradox here isn't just its diet. This creature lives its entire life in the ocean. It swims exactly like a fish. It looks like a fish, but it breathes air.
Right.
And it nurses its calves with milk. I mean, it is a warm-blooded mammal, completely submerged in a freezing sea.
It is just a beautiful contradiction. You know, you look at a whale and realize very quickly that nature simply refuses to fit into the neat little boxes humanity builds for it.
It really does. And that paradox is exactly what we are unpacking today. The mission for this deep dive is to explore the intersection of ancient spiritual wisdom and modern zoology. We're looking at texts from the Qur'an and the Hadith that mention mammals and sea creatures.
Trying to figure out where theology meets biology, basically.
And how studying these animals actually offers some profound lessons for your own spiritual well-being.
Which is an intersection we desperately need to talk about, I think. So often, people assume that science and scripture just operate in two completely separate, mutually exclusive universes.
Oh, totally. Like you have the laboratory on one side and the sanctuary on the other.
Exactly, with a giant wall in between them.
Right, there is this pervasive perception that religious texts are just, dusty books of ancient rules. Do this, don't do that, wear this, eat that.
Yeah, a lot of people see it that way.
But I want to push back on that right out of the gate. As we go through this material, I want you to think of this exploration less like a theology lecture and more like an audio field guide.
I like that.
A guide where the natural world is actually the primary text being read.
That is the perfect way to frame it. Because when you engage with these texts, they aren't just presenting animals as like background scenery for human drama.
Right, they're not just prompts.
No, not at all. They present them as active, living signs.
So let's start at the very foundation. Before we go into the deep ocean with the whales, let's look at the blueprint of what a mammal actually is.
Okay, let's do it.
Biologically speaking, what are the baseline requirements?
So, from a strict biological standpoint, mammals are vertebrates. They're warm-blooded. They possess hair or fur at some stage of their life, and they breathe oxygen from the air.
Okay, pretty standard stuff.
Right. But the defining characteristic, the very thing that gives mammals their name, is that they nurse their young with milk produced by mammary glands.
And this is where the biological imperative meets the spiritual framing. Because evolutionary biology looks at milk and sees a brilliant adaptation for survival, right?
Sure, delivering fat, calcium, and antibodies to the offspring.
But the textual framing sees a deliberate metaphysical sign. It frames that milk not just as nutrition, but as like physical mercy.
Which is so profound. Just think about the mechanism of mammalian birth compared to, say, most reptiles.
Oh yeah, like a sea turtle.
Exactly. A sea turtle hatches from an egg on a beach completely alone and immediately has to just sprint for the ocean to survive.
It's brutal.
It is. But life for a mammal, whether it's a tiny field mouse, a powerful lion, or you and me, begins in a state of absolute dependence.
We only survive because of the care, warmth, and mercy of a mother.
Precisely. The texts use this biological reality to point to a greater truth, that mercy isn't just a fleeting emotion, it is the fundamental building block of complex life.
It literally sustains us from day one. And when you start looking at specific mammals through this lens, the biology gets incredibly sophisticated.
Oh, for sure.
The texts highlight two absolute marvels of the land. The first is the camel. There's a specific verse, Qur'an 80.17, that explicitly challenges the reader, saying, do they not look at the camel how it is created? And when you look closely at the physiology of camel, I mean, it really is a masterclass in thermodynamics and fluid dynamics.
The camel is engineered for an environment that actively tries to kill everything inside of it.
Exactly. We're talking about an animal that can drink 100 liters of water in a matter of minutes.
Which is insane.
It routinely survives in 50 degrees Celsius heat. That's 122 degrees Fahrenheit.
Just baking heat.
Yeah. It has these specialized double-layered eyelashes to block out whipping sand, and it possesses the muscular ability to physically clamp its nostrils shut against dust storms.
Right, but the mechanism that absolutely fascinated me in the research was their red blood cells.
Yes. The oval blood cells, it's a complete anomaly.
It really is.
Because let's think about a human red blood cell for a second.
Yeah.
It's shaped like a little inner tube, right?
Yeah.
A round disc with a depression in the middle.
Yep.
When a human gets dangerously dehydrated, our blood loses water volume and becomes highly viscous. It thickens up.
Right. It gets sticky.
And those round cells start crashing into each other, clumping up, and essentially causing a microscopic traffic jam in your veins. That's why severe dehydration causes organ failure. The blood literally can't flow.
But the camel circumvents this entirely.
Because their red blood cells are oval-shaped, like tiny little footballs.
Oh, wow.
So even when the camel is severely dehydrated and its blood plasma thickens, those oval cells don't clump. They naturally align with the direction of the blood flow and just slide right past each other,
That just...
navigating the thickened fluid, keeping the animal alive in impossible conditions.
It is brilliant mechanical engineering at the cellular level. But, this brings up the fundamental philosophical split.
What do you mean?
Well, if you look at this through a purely secular lens, you see millions of years of random mutation being naturally selected by a brutal desert. It's survival of the fittest.
Right.
But the Islamic concept introduced here is ayat, which translates to signs.
So how does the concept of a sign change how we view that, like oval blood cell?
It doesn't deny the biological reality of adaptation, rather it elevates it.
Okay, I'm with you.
The text argues that this perfect fitting of a creature to its extreme environment is a moving lesson in divine design. It is resilience meant for humans to witness and internalize.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, when you are going through an extreme environment in your own life, when you are metaphorically wandering through a desert, the camel exists to show you that the Creator provides mechanisms for survival, even in the harshest conditions.
That makes perfect sense. It's taking a microscopic biological fact and extracting a macroscopic emotional truth.
Exactly.
And the texts do something similar with another giant of the land, the elephant, which actually has an entire chapter, Surah al-Fil, named after it.
Right.
Now, biologically, elephants boast the largest brains of any land animal. They have a cerebral cortex with as many neurons as a human brain, which translates to profound emotional intelligence.
They live in highly complex, tight-knit matriarchal societies. They cooperate to solve problems. We know they actively mourn their dead, too.
Yeah, returning to the bones of deceased family members years later. It's heartbreaking.
It really is.
They also have an unbelievable spatial memory. They memorize incredibly complex paths to underground water sources across hundreds of miles of terrain.
And the way they communicate to coordinate these migrations is just wild. They use infrasound.
Low-frequency vocalizations.
Right, frequencies so low they're completely undetectable by human ears.
And the physics behind this is fascinating. High-frequency sounds, like a bird chirping, have short, tightly packed sound waves. They bounce off trees and rocks and dissipate very quickly.
Right.
But a low-frequency sound wave from a creature as massive as an elephant is long and drawn out. It literally passes through dense forest vegetation and travels for miles.
Sometimes even vibrating through the ground itself to be picked up by the sensitive feet of other elephants.
Which perfectly illustrates the spiritual symbolism the text assigns to them. In the historical context of Surah al-Fil, an invading army attempts to use an elephant as a weapon of war.
Like an unstoppable siege engine to destroy.
Exactly. But the elephant refuses to move forward. The animal defies the human aggression.
Which gives us this really profound lesson. Immense physical power does not mandate cruelty.
Right.
The elephant is the apex of terrestrial strength, yet its natural state is gentle, emotional, and cooperative. It shows us that true strength can and should coexist with profound tenderness.
And it also reminds humanity that absolute control rests elsewhere. We try to subjugate nature for our own violent ends, but nature operates on a higher directive.
Beautifully said.
So we have the apex of the deserts and the apex of the jungle. But to find the absolute ceiling of biological size, we have to leave the land entirely.
Yes.
Buoyancy is the only thing that can support the sheer mass of a whale. And the whale represents this incredible bridge in the text, the terrestrial mammal returning to the deep.
Because the ocean is an entirely different reality. It is highly pressurized, chemically complex, and most importantly, light fades incredibly fast.
Which brings up a massive biological hurdle. If you were a marine mammal, like a dolphin or a toothed whale, you breathe air, but you hunt in pitch-black water.
Yeah, eyes are essentially useless.
So how do they navigate? They use echolocation.
The biological sonar?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They generate highly focused clicking sounds, their nasal passages, push them out through an organ in their forehead called the melon.
Which acts like an acoustic lens.
Yes, focusing the sound waves into a beam. Those sound waves hit a squid or a fish, bounce back, and the whale receives the echo through specialized fat lobes in its lower jaw.
Which transmit the signal directly to the inner ear. They essentially create a high-definition 3D map of their surroundings using only sound.
And the spiritual takeaway from this biological mechanism is just breathtaking. In an environment of utter crushing darkness where traditional vision fails entirely, God gave them a way to see through sound.
It becomes a perfect metaphor for faith itself. The ability to navigate, to find sustenance, and to move forward when you cannot physically see the path ahead of you.
Wow, finding a way to see in the dark. That ties directly into one of the most famous aquatic stories in the scriptural texts.
Oh, the whale of Prophet Yunus.
Yes, who's known in the biblical tradition as Jonah.
The man swallowed by the great fish. It is a story told across multiple faith traditions, but the specific phrasing in the Quranic text focuses heavily on the environment. It describes him being trapped in 3 distinct layers of darkness.
Right, the darkness of the deep sea, the physical darkness inside the belly of the creature, and the psychological darkness of his own internal distress and despair.
It is the absolute pinnacle of isolation. And yet, the ultimate lesson for your spiritual well-being is that no depth is too deep for mercy.
No matter how far down you go.
Exactly. The ocean is vast and unforgiving. The belly of a marine giant is effectively a tomb. But even in that crushing, layered darkness, the text explicitly states that his prayer was heard.
The physical barriers of the ocean could not block a metaphysical plea. It is meant to be a psychological anchor for anyone feeling swallowed up by their own circumstances.
That is heavy, but incredibly uplifting.
Now, the story of Jonah happens in a fully formed, modern ocean ecosystem capable of supporting massive predators. But how did the ocean get to be that complex in the first place?
This is where the overlap between scripture and science gets mind-bending.
The text actually invite humanity to look backward. There is a verse, Qur'an 29.20, that says, "Travel through the land and observe how he began creation."
It is an explicit call to scientific inquiry. It doesn't say just believe, it says go observe, study origins.
And when you map the scientific consensus on the 5 stages of marine evolution to the sequence of Quranic verses regarding the sea, I mean, the parallels are wild. Let's puzzle through this.
Okay.
Stage 1 of life on Earth, prokaryotic cells, the very first highly simple single-celled organisms in the primordial ocean. The text maps this to verse 27.61, which mentions a barrier between the 2 seas.
A barrier. Now, how does a physical barrier relate to a microscopic prokaryotic cell?
Well, think about the cell membrane. I like to picture the cell membrane like a highly selective bouncer at a very exclusive nightclub.
A bouncer. Okay, I'm tracking.
Outside the club is the primordial ocean. It's chaotic, it's harsh, and it's full of salt. Inside the club is the cytoplasm, the gentle, finely tuned, life-sustaining fluid of the cell.
Right.
The bouncer, which in biology is a lipid bilayer, stands at the door. Its entire job is to be a barrier, keeping the harsh salt out, but actively pulling the necessary nutrients in. Without that barrier separating the 2 seas, the water outside and the water inside life cannot exist.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize osmosis and cellular membranes, and it perfectly mirrors the text's description of a barrier between 2 waters, one harsh and one sweet.
Yeah, so following the biological timeline, stage 2 would be eukaryotic cells.
Right, life gets more complex. Eukaryotic cells develop inner structures. They develop a nucleus to protect their DNA.
And the text maps this to verse 25.53, which mentions the barrier again, but adds a crucial word: a partition.
A partition. So now the bouncer at the club isn't just watching the front door. There are VIP rooms inside, partitioned off to protect the most valuable assets, the genetic code.
Exactly. VIP rooms for the DNA. Then we hit stage 3, the leap to multicellular animals.
Right, single cells start grouping together to form actual bodies.
And the texts point to verses 55.1922. It mentions the barrier again, but then says, out of them come pearls and coral.
Which represents the first complex, hard-bodied, multicellular life. Pearls from mollusks, coral reefs built from calcium carbonate secretions. Life is no longer just microscopic slime. It's building physical, tangible architecture in the sea.
And once you have architecture, you get complex ecosystems, which leads to stage 4, vertebrate fish.
Widespread, complex food webs.
The verse connected here is 35.12, which explicitly mentions extracting and eating fresh meat from the sea. We've moved from coral to actual swimming predators and prey.
And this naturally brings us to the evolutionary pivot point, stage 5, the transition from water to land.
The amphibian step. And the texts map this to a very specific narrative in Surah 18, verse 61. It's a story where Moses is on a journey, and at the specific location called the Meeting of the Two Seas, a fish miraculously escapes and makes its way onto the land. The fish escaping the sea is the hinge of the entire story, mirroring the exact moment life stepped out of the ocean.
What's fascinating here is the intent of the text. The Quran is not meant to be read as a biology textbook. It is a book of spiritual guidance. But the language used to convey these theological narratives is deeply harmonious with the reality of how life unfolded.
It really is.
The sequence of a barrier to a partition to hard structures to meat to land, it makes sense biologically, even though its primary purpose is spiritual.
It's the perfect overlap. Now, as life evolved and expanded into every corner of that ocean, it encountered drastically different environments. The surface is sunlit and warm, but if you dive down, the physical environment changes drastically. The deep sea is a world of extremes.
And those extremes are vividly described in Surah An-NUR 24.40. The verse describes a state of spiritual confusion by comparing it to the physical reality of the ocean. It says it is like darkness in a vast deep sea covered by waves, above which are waves, above which are clouds.
For centuries, people reading that just assumed a wave was a wave on the surface. Like, how can you have waves above waves?
But modern oceanography confirms this is a literal description of fluid dynamics. There are massive internal waves beneath the surface.
Because the ocean isn't uniform, it is stratified into distinct layers based on temperature and salinity thermoclines and haloclines.
And where these dense layers meet, massive underwater waves roll through the deep, completely invisible from the surface.
And the verse perfectly tracks the gradual absorption of sunlight. The clouds block the first layer of light. The surface waves scatter more of it.
As you go deeper, red light is absorbed first, then yellow, then green, until only blue penetrates.
But eventually, beneath those internal waves, you hit the aphotic zone. Absolute pitch black darkness.
But the paradox is, it's not totally dark.
Because of bioluminescence. The texts and the science both acknowledge that in the deepest trenches, creatures literally produce their own natural light.
It's a chemical reaction involving a molecule called luciferin.
And the crazy part is, humanity didn't even prove this existed on a large scale until we invented deep-sea submersibles in the 20th century.
Yeah.
God put lights in the deepest, most inaccessible darkness, long before humans ever built a machine capable of going down there to observe them.
It is a stunning realization of how much of creation exists completely independent of human observation or utility.
Yeah.
The universe does not exist solely for our entertainment.
Which naturally brings up the question of how humans are supposed to interact with all this marine life. Let's talk about the dietary rules, the halal laws.
Okay, let's get into it.
The research points out a really interesting hadith where the prophet is asked specifically about seawater. His response is, its water is purifying and its dead animals are lawful to eat.
Yes. The general jurisprudential rule that evolved from this is that any creature living exclusively in the sea is halal, or permissible to eat.
Right.
Amphibious creatures that live on both land and water, like frogs or crocodiles, or predatory marine creatures with venom, fall into a different, generally restricted category depending on the school of thought.
Okay, I have to jump in and push back on this, because there seems to be a massive contradiction here.
How so?
Well, anyone familiar with basic Islamic dietary laws knows that eating carrion, an animal you find already dead, is strictly forbidden.
Right.
A land animal has to be slaughtered in a very specific, humane way to be considered halal. So why is eating a dead fish that washed up on the shore suddenly perfectly okay?
That is a very sharp observation, and it highlights something truly unique about the chemistry of the ocean. The specific exemption for the sea ecosystem is a profound recognition of the ocean's unique purity and its self-sustaining cleanliness. The ocean is effectively a massive, natural, purifying agent.
Because of the salt.
Precisely. High concentrations of salt act as a natural preservative and an antimicrobial agent. The biological reality of terrestrial decay, where a dead animal on land quickly becomes a vector for dangerous bacteria and disease, simply doesn't apply in the same way in the high salinity environment of the ocean.
So it's safe.
The law recognizes the distinct chemistry of the marine ecosystem. It's not a contradiction. It's an exception built on biological reality.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Okay, having explored the cellular biology, the evolutionary timelines, the deep sea physics, and the dietary laws, let's bring this all back to the surface.
Bring it back home.
Yeah, let's bring it back to you, the listener, navigating your daily life. Because knowing all these fun facts is great, But how are we actually supposed to interact with these creatures?
That is the most crucial question of this entire deep dive, because accumulating knowledge without ethical application is incomplete.
Exactly.
And the texts are incredibly clear on this point. Qur'an 6.38 makes a sweeping statement. It says that animals are communities like you.
Communities like you. That wording is so deliberate, it strips away the idea that animals are just biological machines or mindless resources. It acknowledges that they feel hunger, they feel pain, and they feel complex social attachment.
We see this beautifully illustrated in the story of the cave in Surah Al-Kahf, where a dog is highlighted as a loyal companion protecting sleeping youths.
Yeah, a dog. And biologically, we know dogs have olfactory systems that are exponentially more complex than ours.
Oh, entirely.
They can smell up to 100,000 times better than humans, interpreting the world through chemical signatures we can't even comprehend.
Or take ants, which are also specifically mentioned in the texts. Ants use highly complex chemical pheromones to organize entire societies, farm fungus, and defend territories. They aren't just a nuisance at a picnic, they are highly structured societies.
And this realization brings us to a foundational concept in the text, mizan, which translates to balance. The Qur'an states in 55.7, "And the heaven he raised, and he set the balance."
The ocean, the desert, the forest, they aren't chaotic accidents. They are living, breathing, interconnected systems.
Think about the whale pump in marine biology. The tiny plankton feed the small fish feed the blue whales.
And then the whales dive deep to feed, but return to the surface to breathe and digest.
Exactly. Through their nutrient-rich waste plumes at the surface, they literally fertilize the ocean, providing the exact nutrients needed to grow more plankton. It is a perfect closed-loop cycle. Every single movement affects another life.
And because of this intricate, delicate balance, treating animals with mercy isn't just a nice optional thing to do, it is a profound test of human character.
How so?
Well, the historical traditions recount teachings of the Prophet where a man's entire lifetime of sins was forgiven simply because he went out of his way to climb down a well and bring up water for a desperately thirsty dog.
Wow.
Conversely, a woman faced severe divine punishment for imprisoning a cat and letting it starve.
So how you treat the most vulnerable creatures literally determines your spiritual fate.
It really does.
But here I want to push back again on a specific Arabic concept that often gets mistranslated: tashir. It translates roughly to the subjugation of animals to humans. The texts say cattle, horses, and the sea are subjugated to us. If they are subjugated to us, doesn't that just mean we own them? Doesn't that give humanity a blank check to exploit them, to factory farm them, to pollute the ocean because they are legally ours?
I'm so glad you brought that up because that is a very common and frankly very dangerous misinterpretation of the text. You cannot understand tashir without pairing it with another even more foundational concept, khalifa, which means stewardship or vicegerency.
Stewardship. A caretaker, not an owner.
Exactly. Animals lack human intellect and free will in the specific way we possess it, and thus they're placed in our care. But this power dynamic does not grant us a license to exploit. In fact, it does the exact opposite.
It places a massive, heavy moral burden on humanity.
We are appointed as the caretakers of the earth. We are explicitly commanded to protect those who cannot speak for themselves. Subjugation simply means they serve a functional purpose in our ecosystem, but stewardship means we will be held directly, personally accountable for how we treat them.
So things like factory farming, reckless habitat destruction, or ocean pollution, these aren't just environmental issues. They are direct violations of Khalifa. They are a breach of trust.
Precisely. It is a complete reframing of how we view our dominance as a species. Our position at the top of the food chain is not a crown to be worn. It is a heavy backpack of responsibility to be carried.
Wow. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started with the sheer paradox of the blue whale. We broke down the mechanics of the camel's oval blood cells and the elephant's low-frequency empathy.
We traced the sequence of marine evolution, from the lipid barrier of the first cell to the amphibian leap onto land, mirroring the ancient texts, and we explored the bioluminescence hiding beneath the internal waves of the deep ocean.
And we wrapped up with the realization that the delicate balance of the marine food web and the complex communities of animals on land require us to step up as ethical stewards. It truly is a seamless synthesis of ancient spiritual guidance and modern scientific discovery.
It really is. And as we finish up, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time talking about how every creature is a sign.
Right.
From the tiniest ant carrying 50 times its weight using chemical trails, to the massive blue whale singing across entire ocean basins. The texts tell us that all of these creatures are constantly, in their own unique ways, glorifying their creator simply by perfectly fulfilling the biological roles they were designed for.
But just existing exactly as they are meant to.
Yes. So this raises the ultimate question. If the ant and the whale are already perfectly in sync with the balance of the universe, what does that say about your role in the ecosystem? The next time you walk through a dense forest or stand on a beach looking out at the expanse of the sea, I want you to realize that you aren't just looking at empty matter or a pretty backdrop for your own life story. You are walking through a living, breathing dialogue.
A dialogue where even the absolute largest creature on Earth, surviving on the very smallest, is trying to tell you something profound. You just have to listen.